Today, I'm going to talk about something very near and dear to my heart: missions. Evangelical missions are a big deal. As I talked about in the video on creeds and confessions of faith, the Great Commission is a very big deal for evangelical churches. I mean, that's why they're called evangelical. They evangelize. So missions are a very key component to that, and you'll find in pretty much every church a little board talking about the different missionaries that they sponsor, where they're going, letters, postcards, etc. from those missionaries talking about the work that they're doing. In my family, my immediate family were missionaries from the time I was about 3-ish years old until I was 11. I also have a number of aunts and uncles and cousins who were missionaries, and several that were pastors rather than missionaries. But evangelism has been a big part of my extended family and my immediate family. So this is something that I have a lot of personal experience with and a lot of personal opinions about. So I want to focus on a couple of Baptist missions boards. These are ones that I'm very familiar with because I have family members that were involved with them, and there's a lot to go over. So just basics on my experience. I had a very different missionary kid experience than most other missionaries. My family, unfortunately, never raised enough money to actually go to New Zealand, where we were planning to be church planters. Church planting just means that you go around and you go to places that don't have a church, you start a church, you then train people from that local area to take over the church, and then you go to another area that doesn't have a church, start a church, blah, blah, blah. Rinse and repeat. So my father was very fixed on preaching, and he actually had some really good sermons. I was always really impressed by what he put together. They were engaging, they were informative. He usually had an object lesson of some sort inside of them. My favorite one that he had talked about the 3 I's, and that was the different types of sin that you could get into. Sin of the eyes, lusting after things, coveting things. The sin of I, as in selfish, put myself first, etc. And then the I, as in yes, saying yes to things that you shouldn't. So I don't remember a whole lot of details from that sermon, but I remember that outline really stuck with me for clearly 30 years later, I still remember it. We would travel around to churches around the country, and Dad would preach, we would sing. We had, this was the 80s, so we had a slideshow that we would show of pictures of New Zealand and the indigenous people, and we would talk about the indigenous customs and the way that we would integrate ourselves into that society. It was really interesting to grow up learning so much about a foreign indigenous culture. That was really cool. The Maori are really cool people. As an adult, I'm actually really glad we didn't go there, because I think that the Maoris' existing indigenous ideologies and religion are beautiful, and I hope that they get to keep them. But we would travel so much. So we moved around the country because we would have kind of a hub that we lived at, and then we would drive around, sometimes we would drive all day to get to the city where this church was that we were going to be speaking at. So I spent a lot of time in the car, I am a champ at road trips. I got a chance to see pretty much every dinosaur museum. I was really into dinosaurs as a kid. So we'd go to dinosaur museums, natural history museums, state parks, federal parks. Like, my parents really tried to make it a fun set of trips, but constantly traveling definitely wears on you. Because I was always the new kid in every church and Sunday school, I would get welcomed all the time. And amongst the independent Baptists, there was a welcome song, and I'm going to grace you with it now. I had to hear this at like 80% of the churches that we went to for, several years. There's a welcome here, there's a welcome here, there's a Christian welcome here, hallelujah, there's a welcome here, there's a welcome here, there's a Christian welcome here. So, yeah, I heard that from Sunday school classes constantly. It got really annoying after a while, but because I was constantly in new places, meeting new people, thankfully, I was pretty extroverted as a kid, so I really enjoyed meeting new people all the time. But it kind of sucked because sometimes I would meet people that were really cool, and I'm like, I really wish I could spend more time with you, but I'm only here for a day, and then I will never see you again. So I got real good at making like surface friendships. But I never really got the chance to make like long-term friends with pretty much anybody. There were a couple of kids that I knew that lived in my granny's town. We would periodically stay with my granny when we were in between missions hubs around the country, just trying to, kind of get our footing and go, okay, now we're going to go to Washington. Okay, now we're going to go to Iowa. And, so I did get to make some somewhat long-term friendships with those couple of people, but even so, I was only there for, maybe 6 months, and then I'd be gone for a year or two, and then I'd be back for like 6 months, and then gone for a year or two. So it was not the same as living somewhere where you have roots and you like grow up with people and you have these people always around you. So I have kind of struggled as an adult to maintain friendships and like build those things long term. I'm really good at like if I start a new job, if I start a new gaming group, if I go to the club, like I'm really good at making those like initial surface friendships. But I've definitely had to work as an adult to get better at deepening those friendships and maintaining them long term. Thankfully, I have actually gotten pretty good at that now that I'm over 40. But yeah, that's one of the kind of downsides to being a missionary kid. I know a lot of the missionary kids that actually did go overseas kind of ran into the same thing because they would be in a particular city or tribal area for a while, and they would maybe meet people in that area, but then have to move, or they would get reassigned to a different country. So it's a very different kind of lifestyle to be in missions. So my personal experience aside, I want to talk about what goes on in missions overseas and take a look at both what the doctrine and theology is, what their structure is, and also some of the problematic nature of what they're doing. So first we're going to talk about New Tribes Mission, namely in Papua New Guinea and the Philippines, but they are all over the place. So they were founded in 1942 by Paul Fleming, Seal A. Dye, Lance Latham, and Robert Williams. They said, by unflinching determination, we hazard our lives and gamble all for Christ until we have reached the last tribe, regardless of where that tribe may be. They changed their name to Ethnos 360 in 2017. Ethnos is the nations that Christ referred to when he commanded his followers to make disciples of all nations, Matthew 28:19, and that repentance and remission of sins should be preached in his name to all the nations, Luke 24:47. The 360 refers to the full globe. They are a church planting organization, which means that missionaries go to areas without churches, of that specific faith at least, and create church congregations, oversee securing a building for the church, and eventually train replacement pastors, deacons, etc., so they can move to another region and start another church. They will often team up with other non-governmental organizations that set up medical initiatives, schools, etc. Doctrinally, they are very Baptist and lean hard into that Great Commission. They believe in a pre-tribulation rapture and do not practice apostolic gifts. They have over 3,000 missionaries around the globe. They state that there are over 6,000 people groups where there is no church. The cultures and languages of these groups have kept them from experiencing missions in the past. Missionaries train in cultural practices and languages, as well as biblical doctrine and evangelizing techniques. They have a Bible translation program to get the New Testament translated into the various minor dialects that these remote groups speak. They use teams of American missionaries and local native speakers to translate portions of the Bible into rare languages, typically using a source text in a non-English language. So that way it's closer to what the native speakers also know. So none of this translation actually comes from the original text, the Hebrew, the Greek, the Aramaic. They're going to get a text in Mandarin, Spanish, Swahili, etc., and then translate it into whatever local dialect is similar to that larger language. Anyone who speaks more than one language knows that idioms and other idiosyncrasies of any given language are going to be difficult to succinctly or at all translate into another language that doesn't have the cultural practice and ideology that the original language does. I used to play a game where I would take an English phrase, plug it into Google Translate, translate it into another language, and then plug that translation into Google and translate it back to English. This almost always resulted in wild misinterpretations from the original word, phrase, etc. that I plugged into Google Translate. When you are doing a copy of a copy of a copy, the likelihood of errors increases exponentially. I understand that sometimes that is the best that you have, such as the Rosetta Stone, but given how much English translations vary, the KJV versus the NIV versus the ESV, I would be interested to see the different phrasing that they use in various regional dialects and how that impacts the resulting doctrine and dogma and what is being lost in translation. So much of Christian ideologies are tied to European practices and culture, and the missionaries, colonizers, all saw these non-Christian groups as less moral, less stable, less civilized. To assert their supremacy, they have to devalue the components of the indigenous culture as pagan or otherwise evil. Colonizing is the imposition of religious, cultural, economic, or linguistic practices over native peoples, according to Joe Luhmann in Missionary Work in Colonialism. I have seen some Christians insist that Christianity is not a system of rules or cultural norms, just salvation in Jesus. However, there are a number of very European components to this religion and practice. Wim Wright-Kirk identified 7 pillars of Christianity in Europe. The importance of man's calling, we are here to change, not just to exist. The meaning of labor, work is meaningful, our choices shape the world, and we should take responsibility to ensure that our actions enrich the lives of others. The structures for interhuman relationships, monogamy, protection of marriage, structures for education, and social order. Then there's moral order, certain laws observed in the Bible, human rights, solidarity with the poor, the dignity of man, unique and intrinsic value. That first pillar is the main issue. They believe that they need to change the world to match their religious beliefs. So going into a culture and community that is not Christian must be changed. The early church took common pagan celebrations and Christianized them. But once those were established as an orthodoxy, there has been little change to things like Easter, Christmas, the Lord's Supper, baptism, etc., as they are introduced to non-Christian cultures. Main difference is All Hallows Eve or Saints' Day. The Catholic Church still sees it as a religious celebration, but most Protestants reject any celebration on or around Halloween as pagan. Now, New Tribes Mission is ECFA accredited. That is the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability. This helps establish trust for missions groups by implementing and overseeing financial auditing and best practices. They have sections on their site dedicated to governance, board practices, financial, fundraising, healthcare coverage selection, tax regulations, etc., legal, gift administration relating to gifts given to the mission board or individual missionaries, and leadership. However, there is fine print stating that these are just general information guidelines and they are not financial, legal, or tax advice. So they're an accountability advisory board that accredits missions boards, but isn't actually licensed to be able to give financial, legal, tax advice. So take that as you will. They reference a ministry-focused insurance company for legal forms to create circumstances for how someone with a criminal sexual history can remain within church ministries. Though they do advise that those with a history of sexual crimes are not allowed to work with children. They recommend having stipulations like counseling, speaking with probation officers, etc., that the offender must meet an accountability partner that shields the offender from temptation, chaperone policy, and detailed consequences of breaking the covenant that include revoking attendance privileges, access to church property, etc. They indicate that a church or ministry should have a need-to-know chain of command to limit how many people are aware of the allegation prior to contacting authorities. Due to statistical evidence, they indicate that only a female staff member should assist young children in the bathroom. The ECFA defines integrity using an essay from Franklin Graham, which states, Psalms 119:1 dictates who has integrity, how does one obtain integrity, and what does integrity exhibit. It says, joyful are the people of integrity who follow the instructions of the Lord. And that's it. So those who follow instructions have integrity. Integrity is obtained through the Lord, and the one who has integrity will be joyful. However, the definition of integrity that is used outside of ministerial context is very different. A concept of consistency of actions, values, methods, measures, principles, expectations, and outcomes. In ethics, integrity is regarded as the honesty and truthfulness or accuracy of one's actions. So rather than just looking for someone who is joyful and claims to follow Christ, one should look for a person with a consistent history of holding certain moral standards and practices that can be confirmed and clearly defined. It is a myth that being honest is the same as integrity, or that integrity should be natural, effortless, and just a part of who you are. Mark Hafton describes integrity as a person's dedication to the pursuit of a moral life. He says, embrace a moral point of view that urges them to be conceptually clear, logically consistent, apprised of relevant empirical evidence, and careful about acknowledging as well as weighing the relevant moral considerations. Persons of integrity impose these restrictions on themselves since they are concerned not simply with taking any moral position, but with pursuing a commitment to do what is best. C.S. Lewis defined integrity as doing the right thing even when no one is looking. I believe that one of the reasons ministries have failed time and again at implementing and practicing effective anti-abuse policies and habits is that they are defining integrity, and other terms, based on how they are translated in modern interpretations of the Bible. There is not a focus on drilling down to the practical application of philosophy, but rather looking for certain Christian attitudes or perceived adherence to certain church doctrine. A genocidal despot could be following a religious dogma that is regarded as having integrity within their specific faith group, but outsiders would see their actions as inherently harmful and failing at the basic criteria of doing what is best. I am focusing heavily on this because overseas boarding schools for missionary kids, MKs, have long-standing issues with abuse. Not only were children abused, but the abusers were not investigated and were returned to work with young children without any risk management practices. In 2011, New Tribes Mission created the Independent Historical Allegations Review Team, IHEART, to investigate allegations of abuse. The IHEART investigations were reported only to New Tribes Mission's leaders without informing or interviewing victims. In short order, they stopped naming abusers and then even stopped reporting the numbers. They state that the public nature of victim statements is why they created these programs. Their excuse for not previously creating such accountability or safer organizational practices was that there were little to no legal requirements for care of children overseas. So because they were not legally required to protect the children, they did not actually actively look at doing things to protect the children. The abuse at missionary kid boarding schools went beyond the normal CSA. They scared the victims that coming forward would result in Africans going to hell or missionaries getting put in foreign prisons. New Tribe Missions finally authorized an independent probe in 2010 of their schools in Senegal, finding that they had a culture of systemic abuse. Because the abuse happened overseas, the abusers have never been charged with anything, never been to trial or prison, and do not appear on any sex offender registry. It is clear that high-risk offenders are drawn to such environments because there is minimal accountability, a significant number of vulnerable people, and automatic religious authority. Kelly Emery, daughter of missionaries to the Philippines, was molested from the ages of 6 to 9 by her father, who would drug her. She finally told her dorm mother when she was 15, and they told her it was her job to protect her family because if she told anyone else, her dad would get thrown into a Filipino jail. A few days later, her family was flown to Missouri to have counseling sessions with a mission counselor. After 2 weeks, they were declared healed and whole, but ejected from the missions organization, though they were careful not to let anyone know the real reason for their relocation. Carrie Mickelson told her family about the abuse after they left their mission post in Senegal, and her father reported the abuse to New Tribes Missions in 1989. But he was told, "You are going to ruin this man's ministry if you keep talking about this." The abuser was quietly removed from the organization within the next year. According to 1992 New Tribe Field Committee notes, they had a policy on CSA that expressly stated allegations should not be reported to police. They also made a distinction with gender. Homosexual acts resulted in the abuser being removed from the mission and never allowed to return. Heterosexual acts resulted in immediate removal, but the abuser could be considered for future ministry on a case-by-case basis. Congress passed the PROTECT Act in 2003 that created the ability to prosecute Americans for sex crimes committed overseas without having to prove that the person specifically traveled to the country for the express purpose of abusing kids. New Tribes Missions claimed they made reports to authorities about the abusers, but when local law enforcement was contacted, they stated they had never received such a report. Sometimes the claimed reports were filed in states or jurisdictions where the abuser and victim had never lived. New Tribes Missions did an internal investigation in 1997, but did not engage in an independent investigation until reports gained publicity in 2009. Children as young as 5 were sent to these boarding schools as they were seen as a hindrance for married missionaries, since one would have to care for the children and limit missions to just one person per family. From a spiritual perspective, they said, the vision for saving the lost burned so bright in people's hearts that once their own children were saved and bound for heaven, they were prepared to move on to concentrate on others' souls and lives. Grace, an independent investigation board, they have been engaged by multiple church ministries and mission groups to look into abuse allegations. They found credible evidence of countless criminal acts at just one boarding school. They were not permitted to investigate any other New Tribes Mission schools. There are 4 basic steps to misdirect abuse allegations in these contexts. They trivialize the abuse or harm. They lionize the abuser. They theorize that there's more to the story. Or they circle the wagons and make the conversation about being a persecuted Christian rather than any actual wrongdoing. It should be unsurprising that today most missionaries homeschool their children rather than sending them to a boarding school. The organization currently operates only 3 schools with a total of 8 students. There has been controversy over the outreach to indigenous peoples in multiple countries. Venezuela threatened to expel all New Tribes Missions missionaries. Brazil's FUNAI agency prohibits outside contact of isolated Amazon indigenous groups. Not only are they concerned with the missionaries ignoring and overriding indigenous culture, but also the threat of diseases that these groups have no natural immunity to. Missionaries claimed historic tribal customs were demonic. The Javari Valley Indigenous Peoples Union sued some New Tribes missionaries for illegally contacting the Korubo people. A judge has expelled some of these missionaries. Jair Bolsonaro filled his administration with evangelicals and called indigenous peoples prehistoric. He said that missionaries were helping them change and that they are increasingly becoming human beings just like the rest of us. He has pushed forward many projects and policies to enforce integration of indigenous people into the rest of Brazil's culture. Indigenous shamans were harassed by missionaries to discontinue historic tribal practices. In the 1980s, contacts with the Zoe tribe resulted in mass death from malaria and influenza. The tribe had less than 200 people, but was down to 133 by 1991. Warren Scott Kennel was a missionary to the Catuquina in western Amazonas state. He groomed girls as young as 12 and abused them. When he was confronted by Homeland Security, they found almost 1,000 images of CSAM. He was sentenced to 58 years in prison. In 2013, carvings on the outside of the Papua New Guinea Parliament were removed by chainsaw because they were evil and ungodly. Opponents of this said that at worst, the carvings were inert objects infused with cultural significance as part of Parliament for a long time. At best, they were the embodiment of the living spirit and innate dignity of indigenous Melanesianness. Parliament Speaker Theodore Zurinoak believed that the Bible was the only way for the country to develop. They believed that evangelical religious initiatives would end corruption, but the speaker was accused of corruption and misappropriation of funds. After decades of missions influence, the Papua New Guinea Constitution preamble says they were established under the guiding hand of God and that they have Christian principles that are now ours. Papua New Guinea is an example of how Christian missionary colonizing efforts can erase and devalue an indigenous culture. Missionaries have been coming to Papua New Guinea for over 150 years. These European and American missionaries imposed their beliefs about marriage, clothing, and social order. The heathen practice of ritualistically killing women who saw the ancestor mask as a mask has been replaced with burning witches at the stake. Any brutality previously attributed to heathen customs has just been redirected to a Christian version of equal brutality. And this is the civilization that they want to bring to indigenous peoples. Next up is my missions board, Baptist Mid-Missions. Baptist Mid-Missions was a mission group that my family was a part of during the 80s and 90s. Their mission is to strategically advance the building of Christ's church with his passion and for his glory in vital partnership with Baptist churches worldwide. They were originally named the General Council of Cooperating Baptist Missions of North America. They are, generally speaking, independent Baptists, though I believe they will accept missionary prospects from those of other Baptist denominations, so long as they agree and commit to the Baptist Mid-Missions doctrinal statements. As I was researching this, I came across some information that surprised me. Growing up, we only talked about Baptist Mid-Missions, General Association of Regular Baptist Churches. I had no concept of the Independent Fundamentalist Baptists at that time. However, one of the hallmarks of IFB is that they decry any centralization of authority, and they form smaller cooperative church groups to remain institutionally independent, which is also a foundational belief of the GARBC. Apparently, one of these clusters of IFB churches became the GARBC. So the IFB, the GARBC, Baptist Mid-Missions, Bob Jones University, Faith Baptist Bible College are all very interconnected. They adhere to the common Baptist beliefs, see my video on the Baptists, including the GARBC peculiarity of explicitly noting the prophecy of the Jews returning to Israel and rebuilding the temple as a prerequisite for the second coming of Christ. The mission started with missionaries in French Equatorial Africa in the 1920s. William Haas initially went to Africa with another missions agency, but then he felt called to go to what is known as Central African Republic to reach a cannibalistic tribe, while the agency wanted him to continue working on translation initiatives. So he broke away and set off for the Central African Republic. After arriving, he realized they were not able to buy land or build a church without some affiliation to a missions agency or other organization. So he created an independent mission where they could truly focus on the biblical truths that were being abandoned by other Baptist denominations in the early 20th century. Interestingly, they called it an independent group while they still required strict adherence to a groupthink. Missionaries had to affirm and live out the organization's interpretations of Scripture. He chose to translate scriptures and songs into Sango, a local trade language that would actually become the official state language in part because of the influence of the Sango Bible. By 2006, Baptist Mid-Missions supported nearly 1,000 missionaries in 50 countries. They are also a church planting ministry that seeks to convert indigenous peoples to become Baptist leaders of local churches. They have a focus on translation and literacy projects as they work to bring the Bible to new languages. I was able to find some Baptist Missions documents intended to help missionaries prepare for church planting and get a new church off the ground. It is a laborious series of checklists that includes scouting a prospective territory, determining if there is a need, what obstacles might be encountered, and how to overcome them, doctrinal documents and organizational duties, how to review your services and determine what to change or keep the same. Given their focus on Jewish prophecy, they have many missions to Jewish populations. Their Jewish ministries in Brazil and other regions will hold feast in the Messianic practice. So they take the traditional Jewish festivals and reorient them to be a display of why people need Jesus rather than respecting the traditions of the Jewish people. The anti-Semitic nature of Christian seders, etc., I will go over in a later video. They have long had outreach programs for Jewish people. Baptist Press has been working on a translation of the Torah into modern Hebrew because they do not think Jewish people can read or understand the historical text. As someone who is converting to Judaism, this is so laughable. Synagogues have Hebrew schools for children and adults to teach the form of Hebrew used in the Torah and other Jewish scriptures. There is an immense focus within Judaism on being able to read and understand the texts and prayers. Scholarship is a highly valued skill that is encouraged in all congregants. The way that Baptist people think they need to swoop in and help Jewish people understand the Jewish faith is just an audacious expression of their superiority and white savior complex. The editor on this project, Baruch Maoz, stated that it's like Americans trying to read a classical text from 1,000 years ago, which is just impossibly difficult. I can't help but think Beowulf, Canterbury Tales, The Divine Comedy are all 1,000 years old, and high schoolers and college students are likely to read and have a class that teaches them how to understand it. Why would it be so improbable that the Jewish people would not continue a practice of ensuring the following generations know the language of their sacred texts and prayers? Oh, the audacity. The translation project also translated classic Christian books into modern Hebrew. Pilgrim's Progress, The Mystery of Providence, Knowing God, and the Sovereignty of God. It is worth noting that this project appears to have started in the 1960s, but the first Bible translated into Hebrew was done in 1817 by the London Society for Promoting Christianity Among Jews, better known as the London Jews Society. So they're hardly the first to attempt this type of outreach. In 1995, the Alliance of Baptists crafted an apology to the Jewish people for the way that Baptists have created a theology that is anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, by turning them into mere chess pieces in eschatology. IFB and GARBC would not have been part of such an ecumenical group. Baptist Mid Missions also has a Mormon outreach program. They claim that there are fewer true born-again Christians per capita in Utah than in any other state, making it a mission field in dire need of tent makers. They recognize that trying to argue with Mormons is an unfruitful path, so they claim to have a careful, loving presentation and explanation of the truth of the Bible, bathed in prayer and trust in the working of the Holy Spirit. To preach truth in a way it can be understood brings conviction of sin and righteousness, judgment, and results in genuine salvation. They rebuke the use of temples, calling oneself part of the Aaronic or Melchizedek priesthood, secret oaths, covenants, etc., or using a temple for marriage and allowing women to enter. They, of course, insist the only valid temple is having the one in Jerusalem rebuilt to signify the end of this dispensation. Information about past leadership, aside from the founding members, was nearly impossible to find. I also didn't find much about them on anything other than their official website. I found no news stories, only a handful of blogs, etc., that vaguely suggested there was abuse within the organization, but didn't have any specific details or names listed for me to pursue. They had some videos linked on their site from their annual missions conference, but you can't actually watch them because their account is not active on the host site for the videos. I am curious if that is just a tech oversight, intentional hiding of what was said in those speeches and sermons, or a sign that the organization is trending downhill. I find it hard to believe that this group is completely blameless, but from my personal experience, the only things I would call abuse that I saw was in the form of James Dobson-style discipline, a rigid holiness standard, and Duggar-esque modesty and clothing standards. It would certainly be my hope that no one was otherwise abused. Next up is ABWE, the Association of Baptists for World Evangelism Incorporated. I had at least a couple of aunts and uncles that worked with this particular missions group. It was founded in 1927 by Dr. Raphael Thomas, a medical missionary in the Philippines, after his original missions agency told him to pull back from evangelism and focus on medical work. In their vision and philosophy paper, they state that the unique benefits of ABWE versus another missions agency is that they are first and foremost the most biblical agency, with a base of over 500 churches with a shared doctrine and vision for evangelism. The second reason why ABWE is unique is that they utilize a variety of ministries to feed their church planting. I call this the ad break style of missions. They get your trust and attention through literacy programs, medical care, schools, etc. And then once you're a captive audience, they will use various means to evangelize. Just like the ads for HelloFresh and Walmart pickup during your favorite TV show, you generally put up with the ads because subscription tier without ads is more expensive than you're willing or able to pay. But when feasible, most people will pay the extra fee to avoid the ads, just as the vast majority of people with a broken arm or malaria are more concerned about getting the necessary medical treatment than seeking spiritual succor. But in the remote mission stations, people don't really have a choice. This is the kind of thing that, even if perfectly well-intentioned, comes across as creepy and overly aggressive. Don Ketchum retired after CSA allegations were brought to light multiple times over a few decades. ABWE admits they should have released him no later than 1985, but he is the son of the founder of the GARBC. First girl to allege abuse was taken by Ketchum's boss to confront the abuser, who confessed, and the agency's response was to have both of them sign adultery confessions and that the victim ask for the abuser's forgiveness. The victim was told to ask for forgiveness and called an adulterer on paper. He returned to the U.S. to practice medicine and teach Sunday school. No one at ABWE did any further investigation. In the early 2000s, a group of former missionary kids came forward with additional allegations against Ketchum, and while they were promised an investigation would happen, the agency did not actually follow through. By 2011, the MKs were dissatisfied with the response, so they started a blog. And 2 months later, ABWE contacted Grace and got them to start investigating things, but then fired them 2 years later. They claimed there were irregularities in Grace's investigation, but in Grace's response, they contested that ABWE continually refused to provide the necessary records. ABWE then hired Pi, and they stated they were plagued with the same issues as Grace. ABWE legal coordinator Nancy Anderson lied about and hid the existence of hundreds of documents at the direction of their attorney, Robert Showers. After he was removed in 2014, the Pi investigation gained access to over 7,000 pages of evidence. The interim child protection policy by ABWE was that once reports were made of a sufficient reasonable belief that they actually happened, they would be turned over to an independent investigations team headed by the lawyer that had blocked Grace and Pi's investigations, who would then determine if it should be turned over to the authorities. This is in direct conflict with the state laws that require verbal reports to authorities within 24 hours and a written report within 48 hours of that verbal report. ABWE's Jesse Eaton took a folder of crud out behind the missions office and burned it because it was so full of nasty things. So it was a huge relief to burn it up. This is yet another example of how protecting the public image of a ministry is put above exacting justice for the victims. Just last year, they revised their child protection policy to include robust background checks for all missionaries and employees to be repeated every 5 years, but that is the only substantive defined measure that they are taking. Next, we have Baptist International Missions Incorporated, or BIMI. They were founded by Anton and Viola Anderson, who decided to travel to Africa as missionaries in 1917. Their son pleaded for more helpers in the Belgian Congo in 1955, and BIMI was formed in 1960 after the Congo closed due to revolution. They were part of the post-World War II influx of missionaries into Papua New Guinea, and since then they have spread to 100 fields, countries, and other sublocales around the world. Unlike other missions boards, BIMI is entirely led by volunteers. They limit their missionaries to members of independent Baptist churches that adhere to KJV only philosophy. They have the standard Baptist statement of faith, but not including the Zionistic sections like Baptist missions. They stand against neo-orthodoxy, which is an emphasis of revelation over natural observations that reveal God. Debates about the exact personage of God, existentialism, determinism, those things are all bad. They are also against neo-evangelism, which is a middle path between modernism and fundamentalism, which emphasizes remaining separate from worldliness, but not from the world. They dissent from increased emphasis on scholarship, a more definite recognition of social responsibility, willingness to question dogma, etc. They are against ecumenical movements. They do not mix with apostate churches. And glossolalia, so no apostolic gifts for them. They make explicit statements that anything outside of a cisgendered, heterosexual, monogamous marriage is unbiblical, and they will not allow any LGBT identifying persons as missionaries. They also state that those who are divorced or remarried may hold some positions within the church, but they are not fit to be missionaries. They believe in a total ban on abortions, no exceptions for any reason. One unique component of their statement of faith is that they prohibit lawsuits between Christians, as they believe that the Pauline conflict resolution process is all that is needed. However, they are allowed to make insurance claims against another Christian. Under their standards, they require men to refrain from any immoderate or effeminate appearance, body piercing, and bodily markings. They should also keep their hair short, including facial hair, so no long beards. For women, no pants in public. Dresses must be at least knee length, nothing tight or clothing that would expose or emphasize the human form. Culottes are allowed for picnics or sports, and they can only pierce each ear once. They prohibit contemporary Christian music or Christian rock. The lyrics, melody, and rhythm of music must be conservative and God-honoring. To be filled with the Spirit, one must abstain from music which appeals to the flesh. They say it is absolutely essential that missionary children be lovingly controlled. The welfare of the child, the relationship with other missionary families, and the testimony with nationals requires it. They have ministries within the U.S., as they believe there are some who live in America that have never heard of Jesus. They still refer to Africa as the Dark Continent. They rebuke historical and literary criticism of biblical interpretations and translations, insisting that the existing interpretation based on KJV, New KJV, and the NSAV are inerrant. Just like Baptist missions, BIMI missionaries are solely responsible for raising funds to support them in the target country and must maintain those connections to the supporting churches. So in summary, let's pick out a couple of key points here. So having the children taken away from the parents, put into boarding schools, and put under these non-background checked random missionaries they get assigned there, horrible idea. And it amazes me that they are operating any schools anymore, even though New Tribes has 8 kids they said in their schools now. I don't like the idea of forcing parents to send their children to boarding school so that way the children are less of a burden and less of an obstacle to what the missions board wants the couple missionaries, spouse missionaries to do. I also find it interesting that they are so against any sort of accountability. They talk about wanting to have integrity and wanting to have a testimony to indigenous peoples, but they don't actually hold each other accountable when they do something wrong. They are very quick to ignore, deflect, cover up. It's just frustrating that there is, within religious organizations as a whole, a very deep-seated need to protect the outward image. And they think somehow that these things are not going to come to light. They somehow think these things are not going to come to light when in the Bible itself, Luke 12, 2 through 3, for there is nothing covered that will not be revealed, nor hidden that will not be known. Therefore, whatever you have spoken in the dark will be heard in the light, and what you have spoken in the ear in inner rooms will be proclaimed on the housetops. They create these very strict doctrinal rules for everybody and completely ignore that accountability section. There's so many children that were harmed through these processes, and to this day the missions groups really have done very little, if anything at all, to try and find justice for these victims. So while I respect that evangelicals have a religious belief that they need to share their faith with others, I feel like there really should be some social accountability for the way that they disrespect other cultures and insist on their own moral and cultural superiority. Colonizing is a problem. We have seen it destroy countries and tribal nations. America is a fantastic example of that. The way that we have treated our indigenous peoples is absolutely criminal on so many levels. There's a concept of freedom and rights that my rights end when they begin to interfere with your rights. So my right to live a Jewish life, to live a very gay life, those things are my rights. I get to do that because I get to choose for myself because I have autonomy. That is my culture, that is my religion, and I am free to practice those things. I don't take it to where I am insisting other people be gay or other people be Jewish. I'm just practicing my life as I want it to be. Evangelical missionaries, on the other hand, take their rights to practice their religion and insist that part of practicing their religion is forcing their religion on others who may or may not actually be interested in that. So I have some pretty deep-seated concerns and opinions about missionaries. And I think that my own experience as being part of missions certainly contributed to that, because I spent a lot of time as a preteen and a teen feeling like I didn't have a purpose outside of bringing other people to Christ. So when I was in third grade, I was converting my besties. When I was in junior high and high school, I was obnoxiously assertive about my religious beliefs that I had at the time, about what my church said, about what my parents said, and I was pretty well known for being the obnoxious Christian kid. So I see myself from back then, and it is so cringe. I give myself grace because I was a kid. It's what I was indoctrinated with. I wasn't really allowed to have any other lifestyle or opinions. So, when I became an adult, I learned better and I do better. I really try to express a ideology that is inclusive rather than exclusive, so that way it is able to incorporate as many people from different backgrounds, ideologies, religions, etc., to all have common ground and have common boundaries, and while within those boundaries able to practice their own lifestyle, religion, etc., in a way that doesn't harm others. Evangelicals simply do not understand that concept. It is so deeply ingrained in the evangelical theology that your purpose is missions. I talked about this a little bit when I was going over the common creed, statements of faith, etc. But it is just so deeply baked into all of the theology and dogma that they operate under. I really don't see how you can divorce those two. So I feel like this is going to be a perpetual issue that we are going to deal with for probably centuries to come, assuming global climate change doesn't flood us all out by then. But yeah, we're going to have missionaries for a very long time. So I think it's appropriate to review and understand both where they are coming from and the objectionable things that they do, so we can help mitigate the harm that is done by them.